piece that covers still political things. So a lot of you know that I have done a lot of things in my life. I was a practicing attorney for several years. I've been a news anchor. I've been an educator. I'm now an author of this book right here, Qualified. But at one point, I was a foundation executive, a funder. And, Bill Gates recently announced that the Gates Foundation is going to close and basically go into what is called a spin down mode. And I, in my career as a funder, was raised in a spin down space. So many years ago, after I had finished practicing law as a legal services attorney, I was working for the National Legal Aid and Defender Association in Washington, D.C., which is a large membership organization of public defenders and legal services attorneys. And when I was there, I was tapped by a gentleman, Alan, to come to New York and help run a foundation called Power of Attorney. Now, our goal was to fund the provision of civil legal services for nonprofit organizations. The theory was under capacity building, that if nonprofits didn't have to pay for legal services, they could do more work, they wouldn't have to divert funds. And how that came to be was through Atlantic Philanthropies. Now, Atlantic Philanthropies was founded by a gentleman named Chuck Feeney. Chuck Feeney was the founder of the duty-free shops. And Chuck Feeney became fabulously wealthy, and he had a philosophy around giving. And part of that was that he wanted to give away the money in his lifetime, and he didn't want the kind of traditional foundation infrastructure. So he found people who knew the field and knew what they were doing, and he gave you the money to develop the giving structure and spin down. So it was a spin down of a spin down. So the interesting thing about Chuck Feeney was that he is the reason there was the giving pledge. So he is the person who influenced Bill Gates and others to start the giving pledge, right? But Chuck Feeney's situation, or his understanding of that, was very different. So when we first, as Power of Attorney, as a separate foundation, got money from Atlantic Philanthropies, we couldn't say who it was. Because he believed in giving without recognition. And this is a key element of his giving style and of Atlantic Philanthropy. They didn't have a bunch of program associates who did the giving. They sent the money to people who they felt knew the fields and let them do the giving and spend down. So, but it ended up being a problem because the IRS is like, who are these people giving the money? This could be the mob. And so they eventually had, for years, they were the anonymous donor. And that was a personal point of morality for him and the foundation, right? Which I respected. And then even when they became known, they still saw themselves as spending the corpus, meaning the main part of the money they had down. Now, when I was a funder in New York, this was so long ago, early 2000s, I was, in the rarefied air of funders. I worked with people from Soros, from Ford, from Rockefeller, and we had these discussions around the corpus, which again is that main money, and how much the payout should be. So the minimum payout that you can give and still have your status, IRS status, is 5% for a foundation. And there were lively debates about whether that was right and whether the goal was to perpetuate the institution of giving or to transform people's lives with transformative giving. That's always been a tension. The other tension was, do you have generalists who are the program officers, the people who make the decisions, or do you have specialists, people who specialize in the areas? It's funny, in my life, I've done so many things that this portion of my life doesn't get a lot of lift. And I've realized that as you walk through different doors in your life, you take that with you, but you do leave some things behind. And the credibility and the education in the foundation world that I got at very high level just got lost in the overall story of my multifaceted, life. But that was a part of who I was for many years. And Power of Attorney, we spent down our amount in 5 years. So we were a spend down of a spend down. And that's what we were going to do. Our goal was not to perpetuate ourselves long term. And so that's what I mean when I say I was raised in philanthropy that is giving and that gives it all to transform the lives of people they serve. some of the interesting things I feel about the way Chuck Feeney and Atlantic Philanthropy did this giving was that they did not decide they knew best. They didn't say, oh, we have program officers. They said, hey, you two, Alan and Sherry, you know this field very well. We're going to give you the money. We're going to have you create the program, and you're going to spend it down. And here I am, a Black woman, able to be the vice president of a foundation managing a $5 million portfolio around the country, right? So it's that kind of breaking apart of philanthropy that was everything Atlantic was. So with Bill Gates now saying he's going to do a spin down like Chuck Feeney did, it's really a returning to what Chuck Feeney had originally talked to him about and really tried to promote with other folks. And for a while, the Gates Foundation became that perpetual growing, protect the corpus, give a certain amount foundation. And now it sounds like they're going to go to spin down. Chuck Feeney and his wife, I understand that they passed away in 2023, and they had about $2 million left, if that much, to live on. They lived in an apartment in New York, nothing fancy, and they gave away billions in their lifetime. So they really did do the lifetime giving. And when I was in that world of philanthropy, and it hasn't changed that much, it was still a rarefied world of wealth, access, and privilege. And philanthropy in the United States is super interesting because it starts with wealthy robber barons, right? Who have all this money, and there's an outcry in the public. And so they decide they're going to use their money to help the public, but also to shape policy, right? But they don't actually end up doing the shaping. It ends up being women. White women really pick up the reins of actually executing the philanthropy. So the men are on the boards, they have the money, but the women actually start to execute the philanthropy. And there are pluses and minuses to that. These women in the early days of philanthropy, they did amazing things. They helped bring education, get a lot of people out of poverty, but they also imposed their social standards. One of the reasons we have prohibition came about because wealthy white women philanthropists saw German and Irish folks, cutting loose on the weekends in New York City. And at that time, they were the ghettos of Irish and German immigrants. And they saw it as a moral failure as opposed to a cultural difference. And this actually ended up morphing into prohibition, which the outline against drinking. It was putting using your money to put your morality on other folks. And then, the other thing about philanthropy in the United States is it comes out of that Protestant Christian tradition where there are worthy poor and there are unworthy poor. And as somebody who worked in philanthropy at a pretty high level and then ran a nonprofit, you really see the distinction, right? So the worthy poor are orphans, the elderly, sort of the disabled, but the unworthy poor are single mothers, people with mental health issues and drug issues. They're unworthy. Education is worthy. And you still see that divide today. Social services does not get as much philanthropy as, say, a university or the arts, worthy things. So we still have that tied up in there. And then the other thing that I have a keynote that I do called Reimagining the Nonprofit, where I talk about the fact that the nonprofit itself is female in a pejorative sense. In other words, on the social services side of philanthropy, we start to fund these nonprofit institutions that are run by women, but we don't really see them as businesses. We don't really see them as important. But it's a place where white women can have authority, agency, and responsibility. And when we look at the nonprofit space in general, we think things like, oh, people who work in nonprofits don't need to be paid. We think that because the women who started these nonprofits were the women of wealthy men, women who did not have to be paid, right? So a lot of what we think of that is traditionally nonprofit culture is really gendered based on the fact that women were the ones who executed the philanthropy while men were the ones who controlled the philanthropy. And then the other interesting thing about philanthropy in the United States is that people of color, specifically Black and Hispanic Latinx folks, are frequently seen as not as philanthropic, but it depends on how you define philanthropic. A lot of these folks have family obligations. They fund and give money to family members. They volunteer their time with family members. They don't have either the funds or the energy to do it, to the rest of the community. And the way our financial system is set up, that those robber barons way back in the day with those big amounts of money, well, there's tax benefits to how they give that money and how they use that money. Well, there's no tax benefits to those who help family members, extended family. There's no tax benefits. So our philanthropy is not seen as important. I told somebody the other day, there are no awards for our type of philanthropy. There's no tax credits for our type of philanthropy. And at the end of the day, the problem with philanthropy is that it's your money and you get to decide. I ran a nonprofit, and we'd have people give clothing to us, and a couple of people would ask if they could see the women in the clothing. I mean, it's just so invasive. I gave it, so I have control over it always, right? And that ends up being a bit of the problem in the philanthropy space, is this level of control. I know best how you should use it. And that was the really interesting part about Atlantic Philanthropy and Chuck Feeney. He did not do that. He did not do that in his giving. He did not do that in his lifetime giving. He gave people like me the opportunity to make decisions that we thought were best about how that money should be used. So this is a bit of a detour, but maybe I'll do these detours about the different things I've done in my life, the different jobs that I've had that people might find interesting. I also plan to do one of these on the business of books, because the business of books is a business beyond writing a book. So hopefully this was interesting. And, I really hope that the Gates Foundation does this spin down, and I hope they do it in a way that honors those who they attempt to give the money to, and trust the communities on how they want to use that money, because they could make a huge difference with, I think it's like 20 billion, or maybe it's 200 billion. It's a lot of billions of dollars that they intend to spend down. And I hope they do it in a way that honors the legacy of Atlantic Philanthropies and Chuck Feeney.